So there is something that you probably never even thought about that is actually really interesting. Mario. Mario is just the undeniable icon of video gaming. No other character is as well known and as widely accepted as a symbol for video games than Mario is. Heck, Mario is actually one of the most recognizable characters in human history. From its very inception, the Mario brand has just been a runaway success. But why? On the surface, he's an unathletic, middle-aged plumber with a weird mustache, a strange cap, and a huge nose that is wielding a construction hammer. How in all of Bowser's castles did a character this unusual ever become the biggest phenomenon in gaming? What is so special about Mario that made him become such a stunning success? Why do people like the plumber so much? This is the question that we're going to investigate in this video, because while it may seem at first glance that the reason for Mario's success is quite obvious, things become a lot more complicated once we start to dig deeper. So today we're going on quite an unusual journey. We're going to take a look at all the possible arguments that could be the reason why Mario became such a global phenomenon. We're going to take a deep dive into the economic environment out of which the Mario brand grew. We'll quickly reflect on the nature of culture itself, and in the end we will not only discuss a seldomly mentioned reason for Mario's success, but actually reveal something unusual about video games themselves. So gentle ladies, gentlemen, and gentle people in general, are you ready? Then let's do this. Alrighty right, so before we chat about an often overlooked aspect of why Mario became such a global phenomenon, we first probably should establish the more obvious reasons for Mario's success. So what are the obvious reasons for Mario becoming so successful? Well, it's 4 things, isn't it? First, Mario popped up incredibly early in the history of console gaming, making him one of the very first gaming characters ever. Second, all the Mario games that Nintendo ever released were either good or straight up great. Third, are the billions of Mario spin-off games that all turned out to be great or good as well. And finally, there is the fact that the Mario brand has had decades of franchiseification going on, giving the world Mario plushies, Lego, movies and theme parks. So these 4 points are obviously a huge part of the reason why the Mario brand became such a success. But funnily enough, all these points are also disprovable to a certain degree. So first, Mario wasn't really the first popular video gaming character. There had been over a decade of arcade gaming going on before Mario ever popped up. Heck, Mario famously debuted in an arcade game himself, comparatively late in the golden age of arcade gaming. It's also not true that Mario was the first popular character on home consoles. The Atari 2600, for example, was released long before Mario fought against any monkeys in arcade halls. What about the fact that Nintendo regularly released mainline Mario games that were either good or great? Well, while it is true that Nintendo never released a mainline Mario game that was terrible, it isn't exactly true that Nintendo regularly released Mario games. From 1996 to 2006, for example, Nintendo only released a single mainline entry in the Mario franchise, Super Mario Sunshine. That's a decade in which only a single new Mario game was released, during a time when game development cycles were much shorter than they are today. And it's not just that decade. The wait for new Mario games has been all over the place historically, with many drought periods in between. What about all the spin-off games? After all, Nintendo did release great Mario spin-off games in the times in which they didn't release new mainline games, which, well, yes, but also kind of no. You see, nowadays the Mario spin-offs are all great, and that has been true for many years. But early in the history of the franchise, that was certainly not the case. From infamous titles like Hotel Mario, Mario Teaches Typing, or Mario is Missing, to the fact that early on Nintendo liked to put Mario into each and every game they developed just to increase its marketability, be it games like tennis, pinball, golf, or Punch-Out. During Mario's early days, Nintendo handled Mario spin-offs much less carefully than they do nowadays. Finally, what about the fact that Mario is a huge franchise that is far bigger than just gaming? Well, it is certainly true that modern Mario is highly franchised, featuring toys, plushies, theme parks and movies, but it is actually a rather recent development as well, something that only really starts in the 2000s. For example, this here is Mario. This here is Mario as well, and so is this little guy. At some point, Mario looked like that, and I honestly hope they never sold plushies of this version of Mario to some poor kids. And that's just Mario. Peach design fluctuated even more than Mario's did early on. So did Bowser's. Early on they experimented with different enemies, settings and even villains. You see, the Mario franchise that we all love just took off in the 2000s. Early on the franchise was extremely fluid, undefined and rough around the polygons. The Mario franchise that we all know and love is actually modern development. It can't be the reason why Mario became popular in the first place. So, don't get me wrong, those 4 points are certainly all a huge part of the reason why the brand became so successful, but in my humble opinion, they aren't sufficient to explain the phenomena in its entirety. But then, what is? Well, I'm so glad that you're rhetorically asking, wonderful rhetorical viewer, because as it turns out, there is more to this story. But to understand the missing piece of Mario's mass appeal, we first have to understand something else. We need to understand the economic environment that actually gave birth to Super Mario in the first place. In 1977, the original Star Wars movie was released. And the original Star Wars blew away the movie world of the late 70s. Unsurprisingly, it's a great film, but while the original Star Wars and its sequels grossed an insane amount of money, they were actually not the biggest successes in the entertainment business around the time. There was something that outgrossed even the incredibly successful Star Wars movies. Something, or better, someone ever hungry. Pac-Man. During the early 80s, arcade gaming was at its peak, pulling in revenue never seen before in the entertainment business. Games like Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, or the original Space Invaders were printing cash in the arcades all around the globe. And at the same time, home console gaming was taking off as well. Early gaming consoles like the Atari 2600 allowed players for the very first time to play games at home. Games like Pong, Space Invaders, or the famous Pac-Man port that might not have turned out as great as hoped, but still sold insane numbers nonetheless. In the early 80s, video games had finally arrived. All of a sudden, commercial gaming is exploding. Home consoles are taking off, arcades are doing phenomenal, everything is heading into a golden future. And 1 year later, the entire market famously crashed. In 1983, spending on video games dropped from $3.2 billion annually down to just $100 million, a drop of almost 97%. The United States video gaming industry imploded as fast as it had exploded before, famously forcing Atari to bury the extraterrestrial in a landfill. In 1983, the video gaming market in America was non-existent. A huge problem for a hip and coming toy seller called Nintendo, who had just released the Famicom or NES in Japan. They released it in 1983, the year that the American video game market crashed. Ouch! All of a sudden, the American video game market was considered to be so toxic that West retailers refused to even stock the NES. It took Nintendo an incredible effort to even be able to launch the console nationwide in the States. They even had to redesign the whole thing to look more like a VHS player and less like a video game console. But when the console finally launched in 1986, it took the US by storm and finally ended the drought that the video game crash 3 years earlier had caused. The killer app of the console? Well, a little game called Super Mario Bros. Of course. So that's how the story is usually told. The early home console market exploded thanks to ports of popular arcade games, only to implode immediately after because there was absolutely no quality control. It took until 1986 for Nintendo to finally pull the wagon out of the dirt with the launch of the Nintendo Entertainment System and Super Mario Bros. So why are we waffling about all of this? Well, because in this little and incomplete summary of the early days of video gaming, something remarkable just happened. Mario actually just flexed his incredible and often overlooked superpower. But before we finally talk about this, we first have to establish one more puzzle piece. We first have to do something fun. We have to talk about culture war thingies for a second. Doesn't that sound lovely? So unsheath your daggers, mix your poisons, light up the torches, swing the pitchforks, and in case you've forgotten, it's 2/3 heating oil and 1/3 gasoline. If you have been following any form of discussions about entertainment media the past couple of years, then you've probably noticed something. something very hard to miss. The fact that there is a vocal group of people out there that is very unhappy with the way modern entertainment media is evolving. There are people out there that are unhappy with what they perceive to be the global entertainment media becoming too inclusive and diverse. Here's the thing. I have absolutely nothing of value to add to this discussion, which might raise the question why I bring this hot and fun topic up in a video about Mario. Do I feel like setting myself on fire? Well, obviously, but it's not the main reason. You see, while I don't have anything to say about the topic of inclusion in entertainment media itself, there is something else about this whole discussion that I always found quite interesting. The fact that the art that a seemingly large group of people is wishing for does, as a matter of fact, actually exist, not necessarily in gaming, but in the movie space. Here's the thing, what if I told you that there are movies out there that are completely unaffected from all the complications of our modern times? What if I told you that today you could go out there and watch movies that were produced with budgets of millions of dollars that no one ever heard about before? Movies which don't care about diversity, that don't forcefully depict women in progressive role models or do the girl boss thingy. Movies that respect tradition and honor their country. Movies that celebrate religion and God. Movies full with over-the-top explosions and high-stake action scenes in which a guy just saves a girl and his country without caring about the feelings of anyone else involved. Movies that care so little about diversity, they often don't even cast a single actor of color. These movies are out there, they're still being made, and you can watch them today. There's just a slight twist. The country those movies are nationalistic towards is India, the religion they celebrate is Hinduism, the actors are all Indians, and the movies are made in Bollywood. In 2022, the movie RRR released. At that point, RRR was the most expensive Indian movie ever made. Set in 1920s India, the movie is about the attempt to save a young tribal girl that got kidnapped by the British governor. There is actually a lot more to the plot, but honestly, that's all not important for our discussion. All that you need to know is that at one point in the movie, they fight by throwing literal animals at each other, in which has to be one of cinema's best scenes. So most of you wonderful people probably never heard of the movie before. And if you did, then it is probably because the movie was actually the first Indian movie to ever win an Oscar, which is how I stumbled upon it. And thus I thought, let's try something new, let's actually watch a Bollywood movie for once. And there was one thing that I found extremely interesting while watching it, how close the movie seems to be to what so many people vocally wish for entertainment media in the West to be. The movie is very proud of the heritage of its protagonist. It doesn't care the slightest about diversity discussions of the 21st century. It is extremely straightforward, it genuinely features some of the coolest action scenes I've ever seen in all of cinema, and in the end they overcome their struggle by relying on their heritage, tradition and religion, culminating in an ending scene that has them dance in front of the historic flag of their country, singing to be proud of their heritage and willing to give their lives to the flag. The narrative even features a huge plot thread about all of them gaining symbolic freedom by obtaining real weapons and... well, they just don't make movies like that in the West anymore, do they? The whole thing strikes me as something that lots of people in Europe and America would actually quite enjoy, if it weren't for a very obvious problem. The movie is unapologetically Indian. You see, on paper, RRR sounds like a movie that people all around the world could enjoy. A movie that is almost unique in its action simplicity and ignorance of Western cultural debates. Something that sounds as if it were the perfect fit for an audience that very vocally yearns for art to return to the very roots that RRR is celebrating. But the movie wasn't able to hit the Western mainstream because there is a cultural barrier that it can't overcome. So what is the point that I'm trying to make? Well, that there are cultural barriers to commercial art. Most commercial art forms are restricted in their reach by the cultural context from which they sprung. It's of no value to an audience in the West if RRR were the least woke movie ever made because the movie is Indian and not Western. Commercial art usually stays confined within the borders of its culture. You know, most people don't watch movies that were made in a different cultural background. Most people watching probably have never seen an Austrian movie, or read a book by a Finnish author, or listened to a Chinese band, or watched an Indian streamer. Even though there are obviously fantastic bands in China, great movies made in Austria, fantastic books written in Finland, and wonderful streamers in India. Cultural barriers usually keep these things contained within the boundaries of the culture from which they originated. If something transcends these boundaries, then it is usually the result of said thing first becoming incredibly popular in its place of origin, allowing it to kind of spill over. Most things work like this. But the video game market does not. And this is something that I always found incredibly fascinating about gaming. Just take a look at the modern gaming market, its studios and IPs from all over the globe. Baldur's Gate 3 is an American IP developed by a studio in Belgium. The Witcher games are a Polish franchise made by a Polish studio. Ubisoft is French, so is Clair Obscur. Elden Ring is from Japan. Indiana Jones is an American media franchise, yet the recent game was developed by Machine Games, a Swedish studio. Path of Exiles is a series heavily inspired by the American Diablo franchise, and yet the games are developed in New Zealand. Hollow Knight is from Australia. Ori and the Blind Forest was developed in Austria. Dave the Diver is Korean, as is Stellar Blade. Canada gave us Celeste. Black Myth Wukong or Genshin Impact are games from China. Bug Fables, a game that draws heavy inspiration from the Japanese Paper Mario series, was developed by a Panamanian studio, and we could go on pretty much forever. Heck, a huge part of the development of GTA 6 is actually done in India. The gaming market just defies the rules that other commercial entertainment products used to follow. You know, Dave the Diver didn't have to get popular in Korea first before people around the globe took notice. The game just released into a global market and became globally popular there on its own. Which raises a question, doesn't it? Why does the global gaming market behave so differently than other entertainment markets? And what has all of this to do with Mario again? Well, I believe the very reason why the global gaming market does not follow these cultural limitations is to a large part because of Mario. Which brings us back to the video game crash. You see, in 1986, when the NES was released, there was no American video game market left. In 1986, the American video gaming industry was simply wiped off the face of the earth, and in comes a Japanese company to rebuild the rubble. We are in the 80s, in a time before the internet, a time before mangas become popular in the West. Tamagotchis did not exist yet. Heck, sushi was just becoming popular in the United States at around that time. At that point in time, Western and Japanese mainstream culture are much further apart than they are nowadays. And as we just established, it usually takes an enormous effort for entertainment products of one culture to become popular in another. And yet we know how this story ends. Nintendo single-handedly rebuilt the US gaming market and ended up dominating it uncontested for the first couple of years. So we just raised the question how it is possible that a Korean game can nowadays be released as a global phenomenon completely independent of Korean culture when most other forms of entertainment are still separated so strongly by cultural boundaries. And I believe this here is the answer. It is because it was a Japanese company that first got a foot in the door in the console market of the United States and soon afterwards in Europe, meaning that the entire gaming market from its very inception evolved as a gigantic global entity. The gaming market just never developed the cultural barriers that we see in music or film entertainment because there never were several markets to begin with. I very much believe that the reason why an Australian game like Hollow Knight can become a global success overnight, or the fact that it is completely normal for the spiritual successor of an American franchise like Diablo to come out of New Zealand, or that no one blinks an eye if a Korean game like Stellar Blade creates a cultural discussion in America, is because the console gaming space evolved as a global entity from the very beginning. And with this, we can finally talk about the often overlooked aspect of the Mario brand. So let's do a thought experiment for a moment. Let's pretend we never heard anything about the Mario brand before. Literally nothing. Sad, I know. And now that we all collectively forgot about our favorite plumber, let's take a look at these pictures here. So what do we see? Exactly, it's a guy in a jumpsuit running around in a mountain landscape in which turtles are waddling around. What about this screenshot? Exactly, it's a plumber riding a dinosaur in a lush forest environment. This here, a plumber flying on a dinosaur in space. That one, a middle-aged man dressed up like a kitten escaping a gigantic bullet. You see where this is headed? Nothing in the entire Mario franchise is culturally coded in any way. The Mario games are entirely built out of elements that can be intuitively understood by anyone, child or adult, no matter the culture. These games are made out of bricks and blocks, of mushrooms and flowers, of moles and kittens, of squids and fish, of dinosaurs and turtles, of forests and deserts, and of coins and spikes. All the elements gain their meaning out of the context of the games, not out of a cultural environment. They are, culturally as vanilla as it gets. Everyone everywhere in the world is able to understand these games as they are. All the elements can be understood by anyone, no matter the background. All the elements but one. So, to connect the dots, historically, entertainment industries evolved within certain cultural boundaries and only rarely spilled over to other cultures. Up to the point that even today, in a widely globalized and connected world, there are still movies produced with a budget of millions and millions of dollars that are exclusively meant for the Indian market and barely reach an audience outside. Since most entertainment industries are heavily confined by cultural boundaries, it would have made a lot of sense for the console gaming market to evolve in a similar way. But as fate would have it, just around the time that the gaming market was about to take off in the States, it crashed entirely due to a complete lack of quality control, making it possible for a Japanese company to build up the entire console market as a global entity from its very inception. How did they do it? Well, to huge parts with the help of Mario, a series built entirely around elements that everyone in the world can intuitively grasp. And this cultural simplicity is what I believe to be the final thing responsible for the massive popularity of the Mario franchise. You see, if the video gaming market is unique for the way the entire market operates on a global scale, independent of cultural borders, then it makes a lot of sense for the icon of video gaming to be a franchise that itself defies cultural borders and is built itself only out of elements that everyone everywhere can intuitively grasp. And that is Mario. The Mario brand defies cultural borders. With a single exception, there is actually a single thing in the Mario franchise that is heavily culturally coded. And ironically, that is Mario himself. Because Mario himself is of Italian origin while living in Brooklyn, New York, but his creator is Japanese, meaning Mario is Japanese, European, and American at the same time. A really interesting characteristic, given that the Mario game was the killer app for the NES, the first globally successful console. And with this, we can finally answer the question of why Mario ended up becoming the undisputed champion of gaming. The reason that the Super Mario series is so successful is because it is a franchise that began very early in the history of home console gaming, because the mainline Mario games all ended up being great, because there are tons of awesome spin-offs providing some kind of Mario experience for every kind of gamer, because the series is nowadays a gigantic franchise that is much greater than just video games, and because the entire Mario series is a series built out of incredibly simple and intuitive elements, making it easy to understand its appeal for everyone independent of age or cultural background. Hooray! So here we have it, the unique economic characteristic of the gaming market, how Nintendo helped to create this unique market, and why Mario is the perfect icon for this market. Before we wrap this up, just two more things. So first, a gigantic thank you to all my wonderful patrons whose names are currently floating by. These people not only regularly get access to small additional scripts and bonus content, but they're actually responsible for this very video in the first place. You see, I actually asked them a while ago which out of several video topics they are potentially most interested in, and this video ended up being among the winners. So if you enjoyed this video, you have to thank them for that, and if you hated it, you know whom to blame. Hooray! Second, I thought I'd poke myself a couple of holes into this little theory we just watched so that you all don't have to do so in the comments. So first, I am aware that not only Nintendo dominated the early gaming market, but Sega as well, and that they soon were joined by Sony, meaning not only Nintendo is responsible for the unique characteristics of the global gaming market, but several Japanese companies were fighting over global hegemony in the gaming space early on. Second, I am aware that not only the Mario franchise is built out of very simple and easy to grasp elements, but most early video games are, which is to a huge part because early video games were forced to be as simple as they possibly could be due to the tight technical limitations. What is unique about the Mario series, however, is that they never expanded in complexity as the technical possibilities grew. You know, both the early Sonic games and early Mario were built out of very non-culturally coded elements, but by the GameCube era, Sonic is already teaming up with the President of the United States, while Mario was still stomping turtles. Third, isn't what I'm saying equally true for the Zelda franchise and for Kirby and for Alex Kidd in Miracle World? And what about the fact that Space Invaders was made by an American company and incredibly successful in Japan long before Mario ever popped up, marking an instance of the gaming market developing globally long before Mario ever showed up, but in the other direction? And why did I never mention that the modern market for spicy dark romance fantasy novels also also defies cultural boundaries in a comparable way to the gaming space, and why did they skip over the fact that Pac-Man originally was supposed to be called Pac-Man, but they decided to change the name of the little guy because they were afraid that kids in America would draw an F over the P in the arcade halls. To which I'd like to reply, thank you so much for watching, I hope you enjoyed this little video. If you did, don't forget to leave me a thumbs up and maybe feel especially like overcoming cultural boundaries today and want to subscribe to an Austrian YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, lots of hugs.